Pearl Harbor, November 1941. The night air was heavy with salt and static. Inside a dim naval radio hut, the hum of vacuum tubes filled the silence. Rows of men in khaki leaned over receivers, headphones pressed tight, pencils hovering above message pads. One of them, radioman Second Class Charles Parker, listened to the endless rhythm of dots and dashes spilling through his headset. Japanese naval traffic, intercepted straight from the Pacific ether. To most, it was meaningless noise, but to Parker, it was a pulse, the heartbeat of an empire preparing for something vast. He scribbled each fragment, line by line, then fed the pages to the decoding clerks behind him. On the wall, a calendar marked December drew closer with every intercept. Nobody in the room spoke much. They all felt it, a pressure in the air, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. As midnight passed, Parker pulled another tape from the receiver. Strange prefixes, unusual repetition, the same encrypted pattern they'd been hearing for weeks. He didn't know it yet, but buried in those meaningless numbers was the signal that would awaken a sleeping giant. The code that could change the world was already in his hands. Before the war began, there was another war. One fought in silence between antennas and typewriters, between human intuition and machines built to hide secrets. By the late 1930s, the world's military powers were entering a new era of encryption. Radios had made warfare global, and with every message broadcast across the air, nations raced to conceal their intentions behind mathematical walls. Japan was no exception. The empire's diplomats and admirals trusted their newest marvel, an electromechanical encryption system codenamed Purple. Unlike the simple cipher books of the First World War, this machine used stepping switches and rotating relays, so complex that even Japan's own operators barely understood how it worked. They believed it to be unbreakable. Across the ocean, in Washington, D.C., the United States had fallen behind in the cryptologic race. The once brilliant Black Chamber, led by Herbert O. Yardley after World War I, had been shut down years earlier. America entered the 1930s blind, with no organized signals intelligence service. That changed in 1929, when the Army and Navy began quietly rebuilding their code-breaking bureaus. The Navy's group, a tiny, windowless office known as OP-20G, was housed in the Navy Department building on Constitution Avenue. Inside, a handful of mathematicians, engineers, and linguists worked under total secrecy. No uniforms, no rank, just intellect. Their leader was Commander Lawrence Safford, a reserved man who believed that the next war would be won not only by fleets or planes, but by those who could read the enemy's thoughts. His unit intercepted Japanese radio traffic day and night, logging every signal. But decoding it was another story. The Japanese system produced patterns that seemed random, impenetrable, almost alive. By 1939, tensions in Asia had turned from distant concern to urgent threat. Japan's war in China was expanding. The U.S. had placed embargoes on oil and metal. Diplomats spoke of peace, but the radio waves told a different story. Messages grew longer, denser, and more frequent. To confront this invisible front, the Navy called upon the country's leading cryptologist, William Friedman. A former geneticist turned mathematical codebreaker, Friedman was both a scientist and a philosopher of secrecy. He led a team from the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, collaborating with the Navy's OP-20G to decipher what Japan had created. The Purple machine was different from any cipher before it. Instead of using rotors like Germany's Enigma, it used a network of telephone-style relays that scrambled letters through unpredictable electronic paths. The machine translated Japanese text into Roman letters before enciphering it, meaning the Americans had to interpret two languages and two systems at once. For months, Friedman's team could only collect encrypted traffic, analyzing the frequency of letters and the transitions between them. Dozens of clerks manually plotted sequences on enormous paper sheets, searching for logic where there seemed to be none. Many believed it was impossible, that they were chasing a ghost in mathematics. But by the spring of 1940, through a combination of genius, pattern recognition, and near-obsessive labor, they began to glimpse a structure. Each time certain letter pairs repeated, they realized it wasn't random at all. The machine followed a cycle, one hidden deep within its mechanical heart. They built devices from spare parts, telephones, switches, relays, trying to reconstruct how Japan's cipher machine might have worked. Piece by piece, they replicated an unseen mechanism, testing it against intercepted messages until, one day, an entire line of text suddenly decrypted. They had done it. Without ever seeing Japan's machine, they had built their own purple analog. When the first intelligible Japanese diplomatic message appeared on their printout, the room fell silent. Every man and woman present knew they had crossed into forbidden territory, into the mind of their adversary. The United States could now read every Japanese diplomatic transmission in real time. But what they didn't yet know was that the Navy, Japan's true war engine, was using a different code entirely, one even more complex than purple. In a quiet naval office in Hawaii, men like radioman Parker continued to record and forward Japanese signals, unaware that each transmission held fragments of that second code. A code that would take the Navy's best cryptanalysts to the edge of exhaustion and decide the future of the Pacific. While Washington celebrated its triumph over purple, a darker mystery still haunted the Pacific. Japan's diplomats might have been exposed, but their admirals remained shrouded behind a new veil of secrecy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had its own encrypted network, far more vital and infinitely more complex. It was called JN-25. Unlike the diplomatic purple system, JN-25 wasn't just a mechanical cipher. It was a layered codebook of 30,000 five-digit groups, each representing words, numbers, or commands. Every code group was then super-enciphered with an additive key, which changed frequently. To an interceptor, a single message looked like an endless stream of meaningless digits. 25384999927170112, impossible to read, even if you captured the codebook itself. The Japanese Navy was confident. They believed their messages were mathematically unbreakable, scattered across the Pacific like static. But on the other side of that ocean, a handful of American cryptanalysts refused to accept unbreakable as fact. In 1940, Station Shaipo, a modest naval intelligence unit in Pearl Harbor, began focusing entirely on this naval cipher. Its leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was an eccentric, brilliant linguist with a gift for pattern recognition and a disregard for bureaucracy. Rochefort's men operated in near isolation. They worked in a windowless basement beneath an old submarine tender building at Pearl Harbor, sleeping on cots beside their desks, surrounded by radios, message pads, and the constant tick of decoding machines. Each day, intercept operators like radioman Parker captured streams of Japanese signals across the Pacific and sent them to HIPO. The messages arrived faster than anyone could process. Analysts would hand-sort them, arrange them by frequency, look for recurring number patterns, and hope. The work was monotonous, exhausting, and often unrewarded. For every small discovery, there were weeks of confusion. The Navy's leadership in Washington expected miracles, but provided almost no guidance. The isolation was total, and the pressure immense. By late 1941, as Japanese warships began to mobilize in secret, the men of HIPO were catching fragments of something bigger. Messages spoke of air groups, movements, and special operations, but without breaking the additive system, they couldn't tell where or when the blow would fall. Meanwhile, America's intelligence system was still fragmented. Army codebreakers handled purple. the Navy handled JN-25. Information sharing was slow, sometimes even obstructed by inter-service rivalry. The result was a dangerous blindness, even as signs of impending conflict grew impossible to ignore. In early December 1941, the intercepts from Parker's station grew frantic. Longer messages, new routing paths, heavier encryption, and then silence. On December 6th, American cryptologists in Washington managed to decrypt part of a Japanese diplomatic message, the one that would end relations with the United States. But the military code, the crucial JN-25 traffic, remained unreadable. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor the next morning, America's radio rooms were still filled with messages they could not understand. The war had already been written in code, and they had read it too late. In the chaos that followed, OP-20G in Washington and Station Haipuo in Hawaii redoubled their efforts. The intercepted messages didn't stop. They multiplied. Every Japanese ship, base, and convoy used JN-25. Breaking it was now not a matter of curiosity, but of survival. The men of Haipuo began dissecting every captured message, counting numeric sequences, building statistical charts by hand, and comparing patterns across months of intercepts. It was a form of organized obsession, a marriage of mathematics and intuition. Rochefort's analysts developed methods to strip away the additive layers, revealing hints of the underlying code groups. A breakthrough came in early 1942, when a partial pattern revealed Japanese references to logistics and atolls. It wasn't much, but it was proof that JN-25 could be penetrated. To support Haipo, the Navy established Station Cast in the Philippines and later Frumal in Australia, all sharing fragments of decrypts and new hypotheses. Together, they began slowly piecing the Japanese naval system apart, a single 5-digit group at a time. By March 1942, the codebreakers had reconstructed enough of JN-25 to recognize a recurring reference, AF. It appeared in multiple communications, always connected to fleet preparations and supply routes. But what was AF? A target? An island? No one could say for sure. The only certainty was that the Japanese were preparing for a massive operation, and AF was at its center. The deciphered fragments reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. He understood what this meant. If Haipo could determine what AF stood for, they might predict Japan's next major offensive. The intelligence war had reached its breaking point. For the first time, the fate of entire fleets hung not on admirals or aircraft, but on the ability of unseen men in windowless rooms to interpret numbers on a page. In the next few months, one radioman's intercept, one coded word, would lead to the most decisive naval victory in modern history. The human angle. The silent soldiers of the airwaves' war stories often begin with soldiers on beaches or bombers in the sky. But this one began with men and women hunched over headphones, pencils trembling, listening to static. Inside the low-ceilinged rooms of Station Haipo, Pearl Harbor, and OP-20G in Washington, the human cost of intelligence was measured not in bullets, but in sleepless nights, ruined eyesight, and trembling hands. Radio men like Charles Parker worked 12-hour shifts, intercepting enemy signals that never stopped. There were no explosions here, no medals, no glory. Only the constant hiss of Morse code and the weight of secrecy. Every intercepted message carried lives in its rhythm. The crypt analysts behind them, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, were invisible warriors. Many were young civilians, hand-picked from universities, or even trained typists reassigned after Pearl Harbor. Among them were hundreds of women, the so-called code girls. They worked in silence, often in crowded, unventilated rooms, cross-checking cipher groups by hand, marking patterns with rulers and colored pencils. Each discovery, a repetition, a 5-digit group appearing one too many times, could reveal the position of an enemy fleet. Most would never know the outcome of their work. They decrypted, filed, and passed the information upward, never told what it was used for, or how many lives it might save. They signed secrecy oaths that lasted decades. Some died before their stories were ever told. In this human machinery of war, the line between heroism and exhaustion blurred. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, but they fought a war of minds, one message at a time. And as JN-25 began to yield its secrets, the cryptologists' work transformed from hope to pressure. Because now they could see. They could see enemy movements days before they happened. They could see fleets assemble, carriers depart, convoys vanish. And with every new decrypt came a cruel realization. Every missed signal could mean hundreds of dead sailors. Inside Hypo's cramped office, the air was heavy with fatigue and purpose. Coffee went cold. Ashtrays overflowed. Someone would suddenly shout, "I've got a repeat group!" And for a fleeting moment, the silence broke into applause. Then the typewriters resumed. The war of numbers never stopped. The technological angle, breaking the unbreakable to the outside world, the battle for the Pacific was one of carriers and torpedoes. But the true turning point began with machines. Crude, humming, electromechanical contraptions built from parts that looked more like telephone exchanges than weapons. The purple analog that William Friedman's team had built in 1940 was just the beginning. Now, the challenge was JN-25, a cipher system that had no machine, no pattern, no logic anyone could see. It used printed codebooks, mathematical addition tables, and ever-changing keys. It was, in theory, uncrackable. Yet, slowly, through a mix of intuition and technology, the Americans found its rhythm. They began using IBM punch card machines, early proto-computers, to store and sort intercepted groups, automating what once took weeks by hand. Each punch card represented one fragment of the enemy's language, one clue in a linguistic labyrinth. As the technology advanced, so did the tactics. Station Hypo developed cribs, guessed phrases that likely appeared in messages, such as weather reports or date stamps. If a decrypted sequence revealed even one correct letter, it meant the pattern of additives was partially correct. From there, analysts could roll back or extend the sequence, peeling layers, off the code like skin from an onion. This fusion of human pattern recognition and mechanical assistance marked the dawn of a new kind of warfare, cryptologic warfare. The machines could compute faster, but only humans could see meaning in the chaos. Rochefort often described it as listening to the rhythm of an unseen conversation. Even within the Navy, few believed the scale of what Hypo was attempting. Their work was buried under secrecy so thick that other branches sometimes dismissed their results as lucky guesses. But luck had nothing to do with it. It was the outcome of sleepless nights, coffee-stained charts, and the quiet conviction that mathematics could change the war. By April 1942, the impossible began to happen. Entire Japanese operational messages were partially readable. Fleet dispositions, aircraft movements, rendezvous points, all emerging from patterns of numbers. And behind every decrypt was one simple, profound truth. Information is power. The Japanese had no idea their sacred naval code was bleeding secrets into American hands. Their ships transmitted orders with full confidence in their security, unaware that American intelligence was silently standing beside them, reading every move. Each decoded signal was like turning on a light in a darkened sea. Each relay switch, each punch card calculation, was a weapon more powerful than any bomb. As May 1942 approached, one decrypted reference appeared again. AF, the mystery code group that obsessed Hypo's analysts. To the Japanese, it was an ordinary operational code. To the Americans, it was the key to predicting Japan's next strike. Commander Rochefort was certain AF referred to Midway Island. Others doubted him. Washington wanted proof. So Rochefort set a trap, one not with ships or guns, but with words. He ordered Midway's communications station to send an unencrypted message reporting that the island's freshwater condenser had broken down. 2 days later, a Japanese message intercepted through JN-25 reported that AF is short of water. The room at Hypo fell silent, then erupted in realization. AF was Midway. The enemy's next target had been exposed by a radio man, a code, and an invisible war fought in silence. The tactical angle, turning numbers into strategy, by late May 1942, the U.S. Navy knew Japan's next target, Midway Island, but knowing was only half the battle. Proving it, preparing for it, and acting upon it were the next. The information from Station Hypo was delivered to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He studied the decrypts in silence. Long sheets of intercepted text, filled with coordinates, fleet identifiers, and timing patterns. Rochefort's conclusion was clear. Japan's combined fleet was moving east toward Midway. Washington remained skeptical. Some intelligence officers insisted AF could mean the Aleutians or another Pacific base, but Nimitz trusted his codebreakers. He had seen the precision in their work, the quiet certainty in Rochefort's voice, and the corroboration of other intercepts showing massive Japanese fleet movements. Armed with this invisible knowledge, Nimitz began assembling a trap, one that would turn the Japanese plan against them. If Rochefort was wrong, the entire Pacific Fleet could be destroyed. If he was right, the United States might change the course of the war. Every decision that followed was born from coded numbers. The dates, the headings, the composition of Japan's strike force. The decrypted JN-25 messages revealed that the enemy fleet included 4 aircraft carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their attack was scheduled for early June. Nimitz had barely enough time to prepare. He gathered his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, and ordered them to take position northeast of Midway. His entire battle plan rested on the assumption that the codebreakers were right. When the U.S. task force sailed out, the men on board had no idea their movement was guided not by scouts or spies, but by mathematicians and radio men decoding numbers in a basement. The success of the entire Pacific campaign now depended on intelligence born from static and paper. And so, through the invisible work of the codebreakers, Nimitz turned information into strategy. What the Japanese believed to be a surprise attack was now an ambush waiting for them. For the first time in the war, America would meet Japan's navy not by chance, but by design. The enemy angle, Japan's blind faith in secrecy to understand Japan's defeat. One must understand its confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy prided itself on precision, discipline, and above all, secrecy. The officers of the combined fleet believed their communications were the most secure in the world. Their code system, JN-25, was not only mathematically intricate, but also culturally revered. The Japanese military had long seen encryption as an extension of Bushido, a tool of honor and intellect. To admit that the enemy could read their messages would be to admit weakness, shame, and dishonor. This overconfidence became fatal. Even as the Americans began reading fragments of their traffic, Japanese commanders dismissed reports suggesting leaks. They rotated additive keys, updated codebooks, and carried on transmitting operational orders over open radio channels. The messages grew longer and more detailed, perfect for Hypo's analysts. Japan's greatest mistake was not technological, but psychological. They could not conceive that their opponent, a nation they considered naive in matters of discipline and precision, could unravel their sacred system. In Tokyo, cryptographers occasionally detected slight inconsistencies, delays, or strange coincidences in American reactions, but they chalked it up to luck or espionage, not a full-scale code breach. Their faith in JN-25 was so absolute that they never changed the fundamental structure of the system throughout the war. This blindness extended beyond cryptography. Japanese intelligence vastly underestimated the analytical and logistical depth of American intelligence operations. They believed the U.S. Navy lacked the patience or intellect to handle complex mathematical ciphers. They were wrong. By June 1942, while Japan's combined fleet steamed toward Midway, its radio operators were unknowingly guiding their own doom. Each transmission, every position report, every refueling signal was intercepted, logged, and dissected by Hypo's team. Japan thought its words were wrapped in iron. They were, in truth, written on glass. The moral angle, the weight of knowledge inside the walls of Station Hypo, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like tension, a constant burden of knowing what others did not. The men and women there saw war from a detached yet haunting perspective. They never fired guns, never saw the ocean battles unfold, but they knew when ships would die. They read orders for attacks before they happened, and then, days later, saw the aftermath in casualty reports. For codebreakers like Rochefort, Parker, and their teams, the war was not measured in battles, but in intercepts. They lived between the lines of enemy communications, watching entire operations play out in advance, powerless to warn those who could not yet act. There was a moral unease to this kind of warfare, the quiet knowledge that every message read was both a victory and a tragedy. Sometimes the decrypted information came too late. Sometimes it couldn't be used without revealing to Japan that their code was broken. After Pearl Harbor, that dilemma haunted every intelligence decision. If America revealed its ability to read JN-25 too openly, Japan would change the system, and all access would be lost. So even when decrypts hinted at looming danger, commanders had to balance the gain of action against the cost of exposure. The analysts in those hidden rooms bore that weight silently. Each decrypted order for a Japanese fleet movement could mean lives saved, or, if mishandled, secrets lost forever. After Midway, Rochefort would later write, "We fought a battle of words, and in that battle, every letter was a life." For him and his team, the line between duty and conscience blurred. They had peered into the enemy's soul and seen how fragile victory could be. The war had changed. No longer was it fought solely by pilots or sailors. It was fought by unseen minds, turning silence into power. And now, the intelligence that had revealed AF as Midway was about to unleash one of the most decisive clashes in naval history, where information itself would decide who lived and who died. June 1942. Tacite. Pacific Ocean was vast and empty, a blue desert stretching from horizon to horizon. Somewhere across that silence, two fleets were sailing toward each other, each believing it held the element of surprise. But only one side truly did. For weeks, Japan's combined fleet, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had been preparing for the invasion of Midway Island. The operation intended to crush the last remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto's plan was meticulous: lure the Americans into a trap, destroy their carriers, and secure Japan's defensive perimeter once and for all. He was certain his enemy would be caught unprepared. Every signal, every order, every movement had been encrypted through JN-25, believed to be impenetrable. What Yamamoto did not know was that every one of those messages was being read inside a small, windowless room beneath the Navy Yard at Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his Station Haipo team had done the impossible. They had confirmed AF was Midway, decoded the attack schedule, and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with the exact date, route, and strength of the Japanese advance. The moment Nimitz read the intelligence summary, he made his decision. There would be no retreat, no waiting for reinforcements. He would meet Japan head-on, using their own plan against them. On the morning of June 3, 1942, American patrol planes spotted elements of the approaching Japanese fleet north of Midway. It was confirmation of what the decrypts had predicted. From that moment, every American sailor, pilot, and officer at Midway was operating on intelligence born from intercepted numbers and human intuition. On June 4th, as dawn broke over the Pacific, Japanese carrier planes lifted off their decks to strike Midway Island. Behind them, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the heart of the Japanese force, the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. But this time, the Americans were waiting. Nimitz had positioned Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, under Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, northeast of Midway, exactly where Haipo's decrypts predicted the Japanese carriers would pass. It was a battle planned by mathematics and fought by flesh and steel. As Japanese bombers roared over Midway, American fighters scrambled to intercept them. From the island's command post, Marine gunners could see the sky fill with black bursts of anti-aircraft fire. But hundreds of miles away, on the sea, Nimitz's carriers launched their own strike waves. Dive bombers and torpedo planes searching for an enemy they knew should be there, somewhere beyond the horizon. The first American attacks failed. Entire squadrons of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were torn apart by Japanese Zero fighters. The sea was littered with burning aircraft, and the Japanese fleet maneuvered untouched. But while Japan's pilots pursued the low-flying torpedo planes, the sky above them suddenly opened. From 20,000 feet, a formation of U.S. Navy SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown appeared. Unseen, unopposed. They had arrived at the perfect moment, just as the Japanese carriers were refueling and rearming their aircraft for a second strike. The decks were crowded with planes, loaded with bombs and fuel. At 10:22 a.m., the Dauntless bombers dove. In less than 5 minutes, history shifted. The bombs struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu almost simultaneously. Explosions ripped through their decks, turning them into infernos. Fuel lines ignited, ammunition cooked off, and the carriers that had once ruled the Pacific were engulfed in towering columns of black smoke. By noon, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were crippled or sinking. Admiral Nimitz received the report in his underground command post at Pearl Harbor. A quiet, simple confirmation. Enemy carriers hit. 3 burning fiercely. For the men of Station Haipo, it was vindication. Their invisible war, their months of sleepless decoding and desperate analysis had led to this moment. The room erupted in restrained celebration, but Rochefort remained still, staring at the map on the wall. He knew the battle was not yet over. One Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained. By afternoon, Hiryu launched 2 counterstrikes that hit and fatally damaged the USS Yorktown. For hours, it seemed the momentum might turn again. But American reconnaissance located Hiryu, and before sunset, another wave of Dauntless bombers struck. Flames consumed the last Japanese carrier. By nightfall, all 4 of Japan's main carriers, the pride of the combined fleet, were gone. The outcome was staggering. Japan had lost its best pilots, its most powerful carriers, and the strategic initiative of the Pacific. The United States had lost 1 carrier, but gained the tide of the war. When word reached Pearl Harbor, the men of Station Haipo didn't cheer. They sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of their radios. They knew what this victory meant, and what it had cost. The Battle of Midway was not just a triumph of ships and aircraft. It was the victory of minds over machines, of human persistence over arrogance. In a single day, Japan's illusion of invincibility had been shattered, and it all began with a radio man, a pencil, and the belief that no code was truly unbreakable. In the days that followed Midway, the Pacific was strangely quiet. Wreckage drifted on the sea. Fragments of aircraft, lifeboats, and oil slicks spreading across hundreds of miles. Japanese sailors clung to debris, staring at the horizon where once their fleet had stood invincible. Aboard the surviving American carriers, the atmosphere was no less heavy. The victory was monumental, but everyone knew how narrow the margin had been. One missed message, one delay in decoding, and the result might have been reversed. Back in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood before the long chalkboard that had tracked Japanese signals for months. On it, columns of intercepted numbers still lined the surface like the remnants of a secret war. Each code group represented lives, ships sunk, planes launched, men lost. Now, as the battle reports came in, the reality of what Station Hypo had accomplished began to sink in. Their analysis had given Admiral Nimitz precise knowledge of Japan's intentions, the kind of clarity no commander in history had ever possessed. But for Rochefort, the triumph came with bitterness. Despite Midway's success, recognition for his work was slow and often withheld. Political rivalries within naval intelligence had already begun to cast shadows over Hypo's achievement. In Washington, other officers claimed credit for the victory, suggesting that Midway had been won by luck, not by code-breaking. Rochefort ignored the noise. He knew the truth, and so did Nimitz. The admiral quietly sent a personal letter of thanks, writing that, without the information from Rochefort's unit, our carriers would have been ambushed and destroyed. It was a rare acknowledgement of how fragile victory truly was. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, shock rippled through the naval hierarchy. When Admiral Yamamoto received word that 4 of his fleet carriers were lost, he reportedly fell silent. His staff recalled the admiral removing his cap, staring at the floor for a long moment, before murmuring, "So, the tide has turned. Japan's naval supremacy, built over decades and proven at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the South Pacific, had vanished in a single day." The loss was not merely material, it was psychological. The Empire's aura of invincibility was gone. See, not know, even then, was how the Americans had been waiting. The Japanese believed their codes were unbroken. They assumed that their operational failure was due to bad weather or enemy reconnaissance, not a leak inside their communications network. It would take months before the suspicion of a compromised cipher reached Japan's cryptographic bureau. By then, the U.S. had already begun reading their new system, JN-25C. The race between codemakers and codebreakers would continue, but the advantage had shifted permanently. For the men of Station Hypo, the days after Midway were quiet but relentless. Messages still flowed across the Pacific. Japanese fleet orders, logistical updates, weather reports. Each intercept might contain a clue to the enemy's next move. Rochefort's team knew that Midway had been a turning point, but not the end. There would be new battles at Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marianas, and each would depend on the invisible war of signals and ciphers. Inside the basement at Pearl Harbor, machines clattered and pencils scratched on paper as analysts continued to chase fragments of meaning in endless streams of numbers. The fluorescent lights burned through the night, casting pale shadows over tired faces. Some of the men had not seen daylight in weeks. They had no medals, no parades, no fame. Their victories existed only in the silence of the Pacific, in the ships that were never sunk, the soldiers who never died, the ambushes that never came. By late 1942, the impact of Midway was clear. American forces moved from defense to offense, launching assaults across the Pacific Islands. The initiative had changed hands. Every subsequent campaign, from Guadalcanal to Leyte Gulf, traced its origins to the day when U.S. intelligence saw through Japan's most secret code. Historians would later call it the most significant intelligence breakthrough of the Pacific War. But in the moment, it was simply survival. A desperate gamble that had paid off because of faith in mathematics, pattern recognition, and human persistence. Admiral Nimitz later described the outcome with characteristic restraint. It was our cryptographers who deserved the credit. They gave us what no navy had before: the ability to read the enemy's mind. He never forgot Rochefort's contribution. Years later, when asked privately how Midway had been won, Nimitz reportedly smiled and said, "A handful of men with pencils did it." Yet, recognition for Rochefort came painfully late. After Midway, bureaucratic jealousy led to his reassignment, stripped of his command at Haipo and sent to a desk job inspecting dry docks. He accepted it without protest. He had done his duty, and that was enough. The secrecy surrounding the code-breaking efforts meant that for decades, the true story remained hidden. Only after the war, when classified documents were declassified, did the public learn the extent of what Rochefort's team had achieved. They had not merely intercepted Japan's messages. They had altered the course of the war. Midway was more than a naval battle. It was a collision of intellects: Yamamoto's confidence versus Rochefort's patience, Japan's precision versus America's ingenuity. And in that clash, the quiet men of Station Haipo proved that wars are not only won by ships and aircraft, but by the ones who listen, think, and refuse to give up when the numbers make no sense. The codebreakers had given America a vision into the enemy's mind, and that vision turned the Pacific from a graveyard of hope into the path toward victory. The Pacific War would rage on for 3 more years, brutal, bloody, and vast, but its turning point had already passed. From this moment forward, every Japanese order, every convoy route, every deployment was shadowed by American ears that listened in silence. Because one radio man had refused to believe in the word impossible. When the smoke finally cleared from the waters around Midway, the world began to understand what had happened. The headlines spoke of a stunning American victory. Japan's carrier fleet destroyed. But only a handful of men knew that the battle had been decided weeks before a single plane took off. In Washington, the Navy Department quietly analyzed the reports. 4 of Japan's 6 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen had been lost. Japan's naval air arm, once the pride of the empire, was crippled beyond repair. On paper, the United States had merely won one battle. In reality, it had shifted the balance of power across the entire Pacific. The Japanese High Command immediately began reconstructing its losses, but the scale of the disaster was too large to conceal. Without their carriers, Japan could no longer project offensive power across the ocean. For the first time, Tokyo found itself on the defensive. Admiral Yamamoto, devastated but pragmatic, ordered the creation of new carriers. Yet he knew it would take years to train pilots and rebuild the experienced air crews lost at Midway. Japan had no industrial base to match America's, and the United States was already building a fleet faster than Japan could sink it. In the months that followed, U.S. shipyards launched carrier after carrier. Essex-class giants, light carriers, escort carriers, all supported by a rapidly expanding naval aviation force. The tide was irreversible. And behind this surge stood a quiet revolution in intelligence. The success of Station Haipo convinced U.S. Naval Command that signals intelligence, once seen as a support role, was now a decisive weapon of war. In August 1942, barely 2 months after Midway, the United States launched the Guadalcanal campaign. Again, American forces had advanced knowledge of Japanese convoy routes and reinforcement schedules, thanks to intercepted and decoded messages. Every decision, from naval movements to air patrols, was guided by the invisible network of cryptanalysis. This intelligence edge saved lives, time, and battles. It allowed the U.S. Navy to intercept Japanese convoys, anticipate submarine deployments, and coordinate surprise attacks. Where once America had been reacting, now it was dictating the tempo of war. For Japan, confusion deepened. Their commanders could not understand how the Americans were always in position, always one step ahead. They suspected spies, perhaps leaks among their allies. But the truth remained hidden, locked inside the secure rooms of Pearl Harbor and Washington, where men like Rochefort continued to read their every move. The more Japan tried to repair its cryptographic systems, the more it revealed its structure. Each new version of the JN-25 code, ABC, fell under American eyes within months. By the time Japan realized the scale of compromise, it was far too late. The balance of intelligence had shifted permanently. In the United States, the story of Midway was told in public only as a heroic battle. Of pilots, sailors, and ships, the cryptographic story remained classified for decades. To the public, names like Enterprise and Yorktown became legend. But in hidden offices across the Pacific, a smaller group of unsung men continued their quiet work, knowing that their pencils and typewriters had saved more lives than any gun. Even Admiral Nimitz, though deeply grateful, could not openly credit Hypo's work. To reveal that Japan's codes had been broken would have been to lose that advantage instantly. So the secret remained sealed, buried beneath layers of classification. When Rochefort was reassigned after Midway, his small team carried on without him. They missed his leadership, his dry humor, and his tireless insistence on detail. But they kept working, decoding the enemy's words, one intercepted fragment at a time. In late 1942, as American forces fought across Guadalcanal and into the Solomon Islands, Station Hypo's reports continued to flow to Nimitz's desk, daily summaries that shaped every naval operation for the rest of the war. The victory at Midway was more than a turning point. It was proof that in modern war, information could be as deadly as torpedoes. A single decrypted message could save a fleet, or destroy one, and all of it, every signal, every intercept, every battle won in the Pacific, traced back to the dimly lit room at Pearl Harbor and to one man who refused to stop looking for meaning in the noise. As 1943 began, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The momentum had shifted, decisively, irreversibly. Japan was no longer advancing. It was holding on. But while battles raged across islands and seas, the foundation of victory still rested on what had been achieved in that basement at Pearl Harbor. The codebreakers' success at Midway had proven something the world was only beginning to understand. That intelligence, invisible, silent, mathematical, could win wars as surely as any weapon. After Rochefort's reassignment, Station Hypo was placed under new leadership. The tone changed, more bureaucratic, less daring, but the methods he built remained. The processes, the structure, the intuition-driven analysis of partial decrypts became the template for every Allied cryptologic effort in the Pacific. Across the ocean, in Australia, a new center called Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, FRUMEL, was created, working alongside British and Dutch analysts to expand the Pacific Intelligence Network. Together, they formed a web of listening posts stretching from Hawaii to India, capturing every Japanese signal that touched the airwaves, and at the center of that network, still, was Hypo's legacy. By 1943 and 1944, the results were unmistakable. American submarines used decrypted Japanese naval codes to hunt merchant convoys with lethal precision. Aircraft ambushed supply runs before they ever reached their destinations. And in April 1943, one of the most decisive intelligence coups of the entire war occurred, directly tied to the lessons learned at Midway.US codebreakers intercepted and decrypted. A message detailing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's inspection. Tour of Japanese bases in the South Pacific. The decrypted itinerary included exact times, routes, and aircraft numbers. Armed with this information, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville and shot it down. The man who had conceived Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation was dead. It was perhaps the most precise example of war decided by code breaking, a single message that sealed the fate of Japan's greatest admiral. Rochefort, though no longer in service at Hypo, heard the news quietly. He said little, but those who knew him recalled a faint smile. For him, it wasn't vengeance. It was proof that their invisible war had purpose. Even as the Pacific campaign pressed toward the Philippines and Okinawa, the codebreakers kept working, adapting to new ciphers, intercepting endless chatter. The Japanese military introduced new layers of encryption, but the Americans, now battle-hardened in cryptanalysis, broke each one. Every convoy, every reinforcement, every strategic withdrawal was predicted. Japanese admirals began to suspect that their entire communication system was compromised. And they were right. By 1945, Allied codebreakers had effectively dismantled the Japanese cryptographic network. Every move the Empire made was shadowed by intelligence. When American B-29s struck Japan's home islands, they did so knowing where the defenses were weakest. But the men who had made it all possible received little recognition. When the war ended, most of the cryptologic records remained secret. Commander Joseph Rochefort retired quietly, his role in the Pacific victory unacknowledged for decades. He never sought publicity. In interviews, he spoke modestly of his time at Station Hippo, describing it as a job that had to be done. To him, the real victory was that his men, the mathematicians, linguists, and radio men who lived without sunlight for months, had saved lives by thinking faster than the enemy. It wasn't until 1986, 44 years after Midway, that the U.S. Navy formally recognized Rochefort's contribution. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, acknowledging that his intelligence work had been vital to the victory at Midway and beyond. By then, the codebreakers' story had begun to emerge from secrecy. Books, declassified archives, and documentaries revealed the truth: that the tide of the Pacific War had been turned not by chance, but by a handful of men who refused to stop asking questions. Midway's aftermath reshaped the future of warfare. It marked the birth of a new kind of combat. One fought in the silence between transmissions, in the flicker of radio waves, in the pattern of digits on a page. And though the carriers, planes, and admirals would take their place in history, those who broke the code had written the hidden script behind it all. The war they fought left no battlefield, only a record of numbers scattered across time, whispering of how America learned to listen, and in doing so, changed the course of history. In the long silence that followed the Pacific War, the men of Station Hippo faded into history, their names unknown, their deeds buried under layers of secrecy. Yet, their fingerprints remained everywhere. Every victory after Midway, every island retaken, every fleet maneuver predicted, carried the echo of that hidden triumph in 1942, when logic and patience turned the tide of war. For the first time in modern history, a battle had been decided not by the size of armies or the range of guns, but by information. The ocean itself, once ruled by steel and fire, had become a battlefield of minds. When future generations looked back on World War II, they saw the iconic images, the aircraft carriers, the bombers, the soldiers storming beaches, But behind each of those moments were men and women sitting in dimly lit rooms, listening to the static of distant radios, chasing meaning through endless streams of numbers. They fought a war without guns, but their victories were no less real. Joseph Rochefort never saw himself as a hero. He never sought recognition, never demanded glory. Yet, his work, and the quiet brilliance of those beside him, saved thousands of lives and shortened a global war. Their success proved something timeless, that even in humanity's darkest moments, reason can prevail over destruction, that intellect, persistence, and courage of thought can change the fate of nations. In the decades that followed, military strategy, diplomacy, and even politics would evolve around one central truth revealed at Midway: that knowledge is power. From the Cold War to the digital age, every intelligence agency, every encryption system, every satellite trace its lineage back to those wartime rooms filled with radios and code sheets. It all began with one radio man who refused to give up on a string of numbers, who saw patterns where others saw chaos, and who believed that even the most impossible code could be cracked. And because of that belief, America could read every Japanese message, and the course of World War II and the world itself would never be the same again.